Welcome to part 2 in this series, and we start by removing the camshaft sprocket. So I'm going to use the cam holding tool again, which was from the laser kit. So we just pop that back on there and the two dowels slot into the camshaft sprocket. And then using an 18mm socket we can undo the bolt. Now the mistake I made here is I should have put the engine stabiliser bar that was in the kit on the engine at this point, because as you can see the engine is rocking away quite merrily there, and it would be better if it was stabilised. And considering we actually have the tool in the kit, I should have gone and fetched it. So we can carefully unwind this bolt. We can remove the tool now because it's done its job, and then carefully take that bolt out like so. So it's quite a big bolt, that one. I'm surprised they don't suggest replacing that as well. So the cam sprocket simply comes off now. So what you can do is use an extension bar or something just to hold that chain in place until we're ready to actually remove it when the front of the timing chain case is off. Now to remove the timing chain guides. So we need to use a 10mm hex to undo these two cover caps, and they do have little O-rings on to obviously prevent the oil from coming out. You can see it there, it's like a purple colour, that O-ring. And then we get this one off as well, and that now gives us access to the two bolts inside which are actually holding the guides in place. So using a 10mm socket, these are quite tight actually. We need to take the bolt out. Now I think this one might actually drop if you let go of it. Obviously you can retrieve it later on as we're taking the side of the timing chain housing off, but still it's better to try and pull it up through the top. So here we go, and up it comes. Slightly soft focus there, I'm afraid, sorry about that. So going on to the other side, and same procedure. This one is actually held on with the bolt at the top, and it also slides onto like a locating dowel, so no fear of this one dropping. The other one obviously has the pressure of the tensioner against it, so it sort of pivots at the top bolt. So there you can see the locating part at the bottom for the dowel. Now to remove the auxiliary belt tensioner. So this can be a bit fiddly. There's not a lot of space down there, so it's undone with a 10mm socket, and as you see there's not really enough room there for even a small socket. So I then turn to an adjustable long reach spanner, ratchet spanner, and that actually got in there okay. So you've got two bolts at the top like so. So we just pull the second one at the top out, and then if you go underneath you can get a socket in here, it's a little bit easier. You then just need to undo the third bolt at the bottom, and then there's the tensioner assembly along with the pin that we put in earlier, like so. So our timing belt cover is pretty clear of obstacles now. So I'm now going to put the bracket on, which I probably should have done earlier. Does seem a bit silly that I left that in the box. So that would have made life a bit easier for taking that camshaft bolt off. So yeah, these are just popped in with a couple of 19mm bolts, like so. It didn't actually line up at the other end, sadly, but it would do the job of holding the engine in place anyway. So we can now remove the trolley jack, because our next job is to remove the front bumper. Now we need to remove the front bumper and the bumper carrier. And here's a photo showing the general position of all the bolts and the posi drive screws and the ones under each of the wheel arches. So using an 8mm socket, we've got a couple of bolts here. You may need to soak them in some sort of WD-40 or plus gas, because mine were pretty rusted in place. So you may need to go a little bit careful here. So there are two different bolt lengths. So one is short and one is long. And the long one goes horizontal. And then onto the other side, that's the short bolt. And then the horizontal one's coming out now. Sounds all crispy with rust. And there's the long one. So we can now move on to the front of the bumper. We can move on to the front of the bumper. Thank you. And using a Torx 30, we need to undo two bolts on the front. So again, you need to be quite liberal with some sort of penetrating fluid on these fixings. As you can see, nice and rusty at the other end. And then we've got another one on the other side. Like so. And then we need to move to underneath the car with the posi drive screwdriver. And I think there's about 5 screws underneath that. I think the ones in the corner just hold the edges on. Now it's also clipped on at the top, so you've got to be careful and push the clips in. And the bumper's now free, but we have got some cables going to the lights. So don't pull it off until you disconnect them. So that one just pushes in and off it comes. The second one was a bit more strange because it had sort of like 2 connectors almost. One came off and then there was another one. Quite a bit of corrosion in there. So I think I'm going to have to clean those connectors before I put them back on. Yeah, it's quite green inside that one. So then we go over to the other side. Repeat the procedure. So just push in and pull off. And then I wonder if these have been modified perhaps, and that's why they had almost 2 connections on. It might have been a upgrade, I expect, perhaps to LED lighting. So then the bumper should be able to come away. Now you have also got to be careful because there's a temperature sensor mounted behind the bumper. I'll show it now. If we get a camera in there, you can see it there. You just need to pull that off and be careful with that. So the bumper's now free, and I'll turn it around so you can actually see it in depth. So that's what it looks like from behind. I'll pop that to one side. So now we need to remove the inner bumper carrier, and here's a photo showing the bolts and nuts that need to be removed. So I'd strongly advise that you pre-spray these with some plus gas or some other penetrating fluid first. Ideally let it soak for a while. Now this is a 13mm socket you need for these, and mine were quite rusted solid, so I was having to work it backwards and forwards just to get the rust to break down. Obviously you don't want to just keep unwinding it because you might bind the thread and then snap it. So it does pay just to go backwards and forwards a bit. Keep it all nicely lubricated with some plus gas, and then normally they all come off in the end with no issues. But yeah, if you force it to undo, they can bind quite tightly and then something breaks, which is not a good idea. So we've got 2 nuts there on the lower section, further nut on the top part, and then another nut there, and lastly a single bolt on the right hand side. And again, these were quite stuck as well. So there's a view going through the actual bumper carrier, so you can see that nut as it comes off. Again, I keep spraying it as I'm doing it, just to help things along. So now we have got a thermometer there, so we do need to pull that sensor through the carrier, because we don't want to damage that. And now that inner carrier should just lift away like so. And there's the back of that. Okay. So now we need to prepare to slide the modular front end forward by about 7 to 8 centimeters. So you might find that to remove this modular section or move it forward, that you need to undo the plastic fixings that are holding the inner wheel arch liner to that module. So with those clips out, that should be a bit more loose, but I found that I still couldn't seem to move it. So what I did then was use a 10mm socket and undo the single bolt on each side that's attached to the crush tubes. So I undo the other side, and then if I remove the 2 crush tubes, because it still moved forward a bit, but it appeared that those 2 tubes each side were stopping it from coming completely forward. So I then used a 16mm socket, just loosen the bolts in the crush tubes, and then I cheated and used my air tool just to whiz them out. Does make light work of jobs like that. So that's the left hand, well, the right hand side one from the driver's seat, and then the passenger side, do the same. And then that's off as well. So what they then suggest you do is to take some M8 thread and cut it to 10 centimeters long. Now personally I wish I had cut it to 15 centimeters, because 10 seemed to be a bit short. Because I could have pulled the modular front section forward further for better access, but being that these bolts are only 10 centimeters long, it was going to fall off the front. So I personally would go for 15 centimeters off on those. So I unclipped the horn, which was simple enough, just push down, and then you see it just comes straight off that bolt thread. 10 centimeters isn't enough, because you could get better access. I obviously need maximum access because I want to try and get a camera in there to take some photos to make things easy. Now they say you don't need to remove this coolant pipe, but like I say, for the video I think I do, because that will come forward quite a bit more. As you can see, that coolant pipe on the left hand side is definitely holding it back. So I think what I'll do is I'll drain the coolant. So I'll just go for the bottom hose and pull it off. So that should make life a little bit easier now. Like I say, you don't need to do this apparently. So you should better just reach in there, I think. I think these ones work better, the Facom. Now once that's off, you can pull it forward considerably more. I'll take this out as well, This is purely for access so I can get a camera in. So I'll take it off the radiator as well, I think. But you have got to be careful because you have got the air conditioning pipes on the other side and you don't want to pull them around too much. So we now need to loosen the alternator and the coolant pump to gain better access to the timing chain cover. So here's a photo of those. As you can see, there's 3 bolts on each. The alternator is 10mm socket and the coolant pump is 13mm. So here we are with our 10mm. So there's 2 at the top and 1 underneath. And they say only to loosen it, presumably just so you can pull it forward away from the timing chain cover so you can access the bolts on the front of the cover. So it won't move forward much. Now the coolant pump is a little bit more awkward, but I've managed to get a camera in there so you can see. So you've got 2 bolts again at the bottom of it and 1 at the top. And this is a 13mm socket for this. Now there is a pipe behind this pump that goes to the engine block, so you can't pull it forward much because of that coolant pipe. So I'll wiggle it around now and you'll see the amount of movement you've got. It's not a lot, but what I did was to pop a wedge in, just pull it forward a bit and then pop a little wedge in. So here's a couple of photos showing that wedge and the small gap that's been created. Now I'm going to remove this bolt with a 16mm spanner because there is the cable, I think, to the alternator, and it will just give me a bit better access to the bolts on the front of the timing chain cover. So now on to removing that timing chain cover. So before we remove it, we'll have a little bit of a heads up because there are a couple of Torx bolts there which are unique to their position, and the centre bolt there has an O-ring. Now if we look on the back of the cover, we can actually see the oil pump is bolted on that. And here's another angle. You can see the oil pressure relief valve there. So those are the 2 oil seal locations, and there is that oil pressure relief valve. There's a spring and piston inside that. So using a 10mm socket, a Torx 27 and a Torx 30, we can start to take this cover off. And once all those fixings are out, you can use a little lever or something just to carefully prise the cover off. Could call it a pry bar really, couldn't you? Yeah, so that's the pry bar I've been using. So now the cover should just come off the crankshaft like so. And then I'll include some photos now to show all the parts that we can see. And here is that photo, and we can see the tensioner piston location, the 2 oil seals for the oil pump, which obviously need to be replaced, the timing chain guide rest pin in blue, and in orange is the holes for the bolts. And in this photo we can see where the middle bolt would go, and again we can see the oil from the pump to the rest of the engine and the oil into the pump from the oil strainer. And we mustn't forget the actual crankshaft sprocket sitting there in the middle. So going back to the engine, we can now lift the chain out of the engine. So we've just got to unhook it on the bottom crankshaft sprocket and then lift it up and out. Now to my untrained eyes it doesn't actually look that bad, but saying that, there is some scratching on the outside of the chain, so whether centrifugal force has actually sort of flown the chain outwards slightly and it's contacted something and done a bit of scratching, I don't know. So I just fancied comparing the slack in the old chain versus the new chain. So I've popped the old chain back on and the guides and everything else. and I've got 11mm protruding from the tensioner piston. I'll just confirm that again, and I even check with the vernier, and it's definitely 11mm. So now onto the new chain. Now immediately we can see it's not protruding as much, so this chain obviously is shorter in effect. So when I get it steady there, we've got about 7mm protruding. So that's actually 4mm less than the old chain. So as we can see, the old chain had definitely stretched. So anyway, now on to finally removing the crankshaft sprocket. So I cut another piece of thread, and I would advise you cut 95mm if you can find a 12mm metal spacer. The problem with just putting the thread in on its own, as you'll see in this next clip, is that that thread will still bend because it's basically unsupported. So I'll still include this bit because it's probably quite important to see the mistake I made. So I put the rod through, obviously, to protect the threads. But as you can see, it's protruding there on its own. Now I did put a cloth down the bottom to stop anything falling into the sump, because there is a hole there, obviously, for the oil to drain back into the sump. Obviously I don't want to lose anything in case there was a pin that might have come out of that sprocket. So I went for a two-legged puller because my three-legged wouldn't fit. This one was really probably a little bit too big. It didn't really want to fit in there. But it was there. And had to make do with what I had at the time. So what did happen was, as the tension started to come on, the crank actually started to turn, as you can see there, so that wasn't much use. So clearly the engine needs to be locked. So it's back inside, pop it back into 5th gear, and use my extension rods just to put the foot brake on. And that does hold it nicely. So what happened now was the threaded rod started to bend, and then the puller flew off. As you can see, there we are. So it's completely bent. So what I then did was cut the rod so that it was exactly the right length, which is the 95mm plus 12mm spacer. Now that meant I was pushing it onto the end of the crankshaft, not onto the rod. So then back on with my two-legged puller. You can view better like I am there if you look down between the top. So we managed to get the puller on, and hopefully this is going to be more successful. So you can view it quite nicely from above. I'll speed this up. And we've got movement of the sprocket, which is fantastic. I was somewhat concerned whether I'd actually better pull this off with that puller, but thankfully it was working. So it's nearly off now. Note the locating pin on the left hand side. So that could have still, well, it wouldn't have fallen into the sump, but putting a cloth there is a good idea. So there's the little pin. I'll pop it back on just so you can see it again. That pin on the left hand side, because the new one's got to locate over that pin. Okay, so I can now take the car out of gear and take the foot brake off. So we're basically at the point now of putting everything back together. I was curious to know how the chain tensioner worked, so time to dissect. So with my Dremel in hand, I popped the little tensioner in there. I think my curiosity was about how you can push the piston down and sometimes it would stay there or it would pop back up. And I sort of needed to know what was going on inside to do that. So I sort of had this concern that if you push it in and it stays in, then you pop it into the actual car, could it actually stay stuck down? And that was really quite concerning me. So I needed to know what was actually going on. So here we go. It's cracking it open. Now we've got a spring in there. We've got a ball bearing, I know that much. Oh, there's the ball bearing gone. And so there's like a spring clip around the piston. That must be what keeps it held on, because there's some like serrated parts in the body. So when you push it down, that spring clip on there must be what sort of jams and holds it in the closed position. Now I presume oil must go through that ball bearing and pressurise it, because there's little holes in the piston as well for oil to come through. So I'm going to just change the camera angle. I've cleaned it all up a bit now, so we can see. I'm not sure if that split ring actually goes into the larger gap or not. Yeah, so there's like a valve there, isn't there, for the oil to push through and push on that tensioner, I suppose. Perhaps as the oil pump gets more pressurised, the faster the engine goes, it puts more pressure onto this piston to keep the chain tight. But anyway, so that's what's inside the tensioner. So I'll include some photographs now, and we'll start with the crank sprocket. And there you can see the two triangular marks and the keyway slot for the locating pin. And just out of interest, this was the old chain which is made by JWIS. And here's the old tensioner in position. I've highlighted in red where the oil ways are. And here's a crankshaft sprocket on the crank, and the locating pin is in yellow. And here again is a view of that locating pin. And here's the back of the timing chain cover, where I've put the chain and the sprocket to show it in relation to the webbing that appears to prevent the timing chain from jumping teeth. Now the webbing here isn't actually damaged, but if the chain was badly worn, I believe it can actually stretch and then wear away this webbing, and then parts of it would fall off into the sump. Now moving on to the timing chain tensioner piston, which I've cut in half with a Dremel. And those are all the parts that make it up. And another camera angle here, showing that ball bearing against the little hole for the oil way. And in this photo you can see an oil path in that black plastic cap. So clearly oil is meant to be flowing inside that towards the ball bearing. Here you can clearly see the ridges inside the housing, and I'm presuming those are what helps to hold the piston in position when you come to fit it. And the little round spring clip presumably holds it in place. And finally another photo clearly showing the oil way path in the end cap. You've been watching replacing the timing chain on a Mini 1 R50. Thank you for watching part 2, and hope this video helps you replace your timing chain in your Mini R50 if you need to. This video was filmed and edited by me, Mark Savage, in May 2021. I can be found on Instagram and Facebook under Coats and Gators.